Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen.
And today's episode, Kristen, I think we have had the incredible fortune to interview, people who've won Super Bowls, people who are Major League Baseball Hall of Famers coming out. Like, we've got so many cool celebrities that we've gotten to interact with. But because it's Kristen's probably favorite celebrity is our guest today, who is a statistician and professor of economics at Brown University. So you can tell that not all heroes wear capes. And this is one of Kristen's heroes and favorite celebrities in the world that we're going to talk to today.
So we are bringing on Professor Emily Oster, who is she's an economics professor at Brown. She's a PhD in economics from Harvard, but I know her from her book, Expecting Better, which she wrote to basically debunk a lot of the rules of pregnancy. So she obviously had gone to school, and as a PhD, it's like you learn how to interpret different types of data and look at research and say, this study, what are some of the things that could have influenced this outcome, blah, blah, blah. And so when she got pregnant with her, I think it was her first daughter, and she'll tell the story, she was like, okay, why is it that I can't have sushi? Why is it that I can't have deli meat? Yes. Or caffeine.
Soft serve ice cream.
Why is it that there's only you can only have 200 milligrams of caffeine? And so she essentially looked at the data and wrote this book to explain to people, this is what the data says. And almost, as she puts it, breaks things down for people like they're adults. So anyway, I was so excited to be able to talk to her. This was, just so exciting. But it's interesting too, because again, she's actually an economist. And this is in light of just what happened last week with Trump firing the BLS commissioner because the jobs data was revised. So it's goes back to quality of data. And so
the theme of good data, bad data is one that we're going to get into today. And we're going to have a kind of companion conversation about decisions that people make about when or whether or not to have a family over the lifetime of their career. But first, on the good data, bad data point, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I recall correctly, there's a study that she points to in that book, Expecting Better, about caffeine, right? Mm-hmm. Where it was, okay, well, let's take a look at the study that produced the current doctrine about how much caffeine you're able to consume as a pregnant woman. And wasn't it that half of the participants were also using cocaine?
Oh, so that's the alcohol study. So yeah, so she, by the way, study. I will say, she got a ton of pushback when she, I think, initially wrote her book, because she looked at the studies on alcohol in pregnancy. And one of the things is okay, if you are drinking alcohol in pregnancy when you've been told not to do that, the type of person that's going to be drinking alcohol is a different type of person than the type of person who is abstaining. So if you look at historically, just you take a look at the sampling of people who drink alcohol versus who don't, there's maybe some other variables. But the whole point is, in some of these studies that are again included, it's well, the people that are in the alcohol group are also 70% of the people were also, taking cocaine. So it's, which is the thing that caused the negative outcome. And we're not saying you should be drinking alcohol when you're pregnant. That's not the point. But she's just saying, this is what the actual data is. This is what the studies are. These are the problems with some of these studies. And again, I think it's just a really interesting, anecdote to at least understand where these rules come from. There's this woman, I think her name is Gretchen Rubinstein, and she has this different, these 4 types of people where it's the questioner versus the person who just does what they're told, or the person who is a people pleaser. And I'm always someone who's a questioner. I want to understand why you tell me to do something. I need to understand the reason. And then it's I will follow it all day, every day till I'm blue in the face. But if I think that is a stupid reason, then I'll be well,
Yeah, I am not a questioner. I am the person who just follows the rules. I love a rule. So I'm well, there must have been a good reason for this rule. Let's all follow the rule. Why would you ever create a rule where there wasn't a reason? But coming back to the kind of timeliness of this podcast. So last Friday, we've spoken about this before on the podcast, but if you are not familiar with the most important bellwethers of economic data that tend to move the markets, the non-farm payrolls report, which is released the first Friday of every single month, is, I would argue, the most important singular data point that we get about the trajectory of the economy and the likely path of monetary policy. You'll recall that the Fed has a dual mandate. One is to maximize employment, and one is to maintain stable prices. So they're trying to keep inflation close to their 2% target. The non-farm payrolls report tells us about the employment side of that dual mandate. That's why it's so important. I've told this story before. famously, I had my rehearsal dinner on a non-farm payrolls Friday, and it was like an international event. People were like, how could you possibly make people risk missing the non-farm payrolls report to go to your wedding? I was like, well, maybe this is by design. Try to keep the guest list small. I don't know. But anyways, so last Friday, we got the non-farm payrolls report for July. And remember, the report that's issued each month is for the prior month. But what we also get is the revisions to prior months reporting before that. Because two actually podcasts that we listen to, Odd Lots and Planet Money, have recently interviewed economists who actually speak to the methodology of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They are the ones who collect this data, because how incomplete that reporting data is due to the various policies and procedures and methodologies that they use to collect this data. So they keep getting responses in. It's not like, it's funny, it's just like polling, right? I've never participated in a political poll. So it's like, there's polling data here. And there's so many people who can speak to these different data collection methods. That's beyond the scope of this podcast here. But what happens every month is the market economists all over Wall Street, they come up with their estimates of what they expect the headline number of jobs added to the economy to be and what the unemployment rate is likely to be. And those jobs added come from surveying businesses. And then we get the household survey where you actually talk to people like, are you collecting unemployment? Like, what are you doing? So the consensus estimate was, I think, something like, of course, I should have written this down, I think 109,000 jobs. And we only added 73,000 jobs. Now, that sounds like a big miss, right? Like, oh my gosh, an order of magnitude of like a 25% miss. Well, no, actually, we get very, very large misses all the time. There were some historical misses. I think during April of 2020, during COVID, we had a miss by like 625,000 jobs because of the absolute chaos of trying to report. Now, an order of magnitude that big, by the way, led to Fed intervention. The Fed eased monetary policy and cut rates and intervened to stimulate the economy. So you get a big miss, and that can signal that there's going to be a change in monetary policy. So 25,000 jobs or 30,000 jobs of a miss, it's a good sized miss. But what was much more telling was actually the revisions to prior months. So we had downward revisions to the months of June and May of something on the order of magnitude of 258,000 jobs. And we haven't seen orders of magnitude that large in those revisions since COVID. Now, what those two podcasts that I referenced discussed was the overall trend of deteriorating reporting over time, how things haven't really bounced back since COVID. I mean, I remember when I was on the trading floor, not in the later part of my career, but at the very beginning part of my career when I was being taught about how to interpret this data. And people were like, and you can't rely on these numbers anymore. And this was in like 2006 when I first started. And they were like, the numbers are garbage. It's rigged. So it's nothing new for people to be questioning the accuracy of this data on Wall Street. The people who are looking at these numbers day in, day out, can talk till they're blue in the face about like who had the number early, like what does the number really mean? How much can we rely on this? What we saw was a massive reaction and a massive repricing of the market's estimates that the Fed is likely to cut rates by 25 basis points at the next meeting. I mean, at one point it felt during the day like there was the potential for there to be an emergency cut. But what really actually was newsworthy was the fact that after that data was released, President Trump summarily fired the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, saying that these revisions were in fact politically motivated, that there was an attempt through these revisions to undermine the strong economy under the Trump administration. There's a lot of irony in that because by the same token, the Trump administration has been very vocal about advocating for lower interest rates. Well, back to the Fed's dual mandate. Were we to get a strong, clear-cut signal in either direction, which is what Chairman Powell has been saying they are looking for. They're looking for kind of incontrovertible evidence that either inflation's out of control and we need to maintain a high interest rate regime, or that truly there is softness in the economy and we therefore need to stimulate it. We just got that signal.
I know.
So you got the thing you were looking for. You got the big waving red flag of, hey, okay, the Fed might need to do something now. But if you then all of a sudden say this data is all suspect, well, how are we then to interpret the signal that would lead to a greater likelihood of the policy that you want? Yeah. So it's created a ton of conversations right now about the validity and the usage and the methodology around economic data. And so I think no one better to talk about this than Professor Emily Oster, who is, about as
good data, bad data
as they come on data.
Well, two things. One, I forget if it was on Odd Lots or where it was. They were saying that actually the fact that there was big revisions, like those usually happen when there is some turning point in the economy. Like that's when you see it. So the fact that there was revisions, like in and of itself is a signal.
To your point, to piggyback on that, what's happening in the economy that is likely the turning point that they are referencing is the impact of both tariffs and potentially immigration policy on small businesses who then become delayed in their reporting or aren't necessarily reporting the most accurate numbers at any given point in time because they're trying to understand all these other factors impacting their business.
Yeah, such an important point. But the other thing that we talked to Emily about, so we get into the good data, bad data, which I love how that should be like the title of this episode is good data, bad data. But we also touch on just some of the really important questions that, again, parents have, because one of the most common questions we get, obviously, in addition to like, how do I break onto Wall Street, is essentially like, can you talk about being a parent and working a full-time job, working a demanding job? I mean, I said to Jen today, like I did not sleep last night because again, baby's 6 weeks old. And so one of the things that we talk about in the episode is like on this concept of sleep training. Like, does it show that you're going to damage your child? Like all of these things that I think a lot of parents have anxiety about, like there's things that they could do that would make it easier to balance work and child. But again, people have so much shame and like fear around these things. And then we also get into at the very end, a kind of, I thought, interesting question. There was this study that came out recently about just like, if you have a certain gender, like Jen and I, when we first started this podcast, I had 3 girls, she had 3 boys, and there was this big Harvard.
Where's my third boy?
Oh my God, this is what I'm saying. See, this is what happens when you don't sleep. It's like you basically like your brain stops working. Sorry, I had 3 girls, Jen had 2 boys, and obviously I just had a fourth that it was a boy. But so we talk about like, is there validity to this study? So it's kind of a very interesting answer that she gives. Which
and for those of you who aren't necessarily concerned about parenthood and that's not of interest to you, and you're really here for the investment theses and the market know-how, one of the most impactful parts of our conversation was when Emily talked about how good data is not just about conducting a study well, but it's about asking the right question. And I think that that is such a critical takeaway for our investors, that when you're running a model, when you're thinking about an investment thesis, are you asking the right question about the asset class, the overall economy, the individual company, whatever it may be, and how figuring out how to frame that question ultimately is quite possibly the most important part of having a successful analysis rather than simply just how you actually get the data. So I think her explanation of how that all worked made a lot of things just click for me on a more philosophical level from an investing standpoint, and help me make a more cohesive sense of things that you kind of instinctually feel and what separates not only good data from bad data, but good investors from bad investors. Love it. So I'm really excited to get her on here.
Awesome. Let's bring her on. We are so excited to be joined here by Professor Emily Oster, who has a PhD in economics from Harvard. She is a professor at Brown in economics. But I mean, I know for me, I first got introduced to you because you wrote this best-selling book called Expecting Better that basically breaks down the rules of pregnancy, sort of like where they come from, what does the data actually say? And so we're going to explore a whole bunch of different themes today, starting with like, what can data tell you? What should you be thoughtful about? To questions about more lifestyle for women or men who are potentially putting their, child's decisions on hold and want to be parents older. That was the case for, I know me and Jen a little bit. Like, what does the data say about that? And so many kind of cool things here. So if you could start just giving a background on how you went from economics to becoming this like data expert. If you could give us a little bit of your story, that would be amazing.
Sure. So I am trained as an economist. I have a PhD in economics from Harvard, and my area of research is kind of health and statistical methods. So I sort of work on questions like how can we learn causality out of observational data, and why don't people make all the health choices we think that they should. So I was a professor at the University of Chicago at the Booth School of Business. My husband is also an economist. So we were both there as junior faculty, and I got pregnant with my now 14-year-old. And it was like quite a transformative, I mean, pregnancy and childbearing are always transformative moments. But for me, in addition to all the personal transformation, it was also a kind of work transformation. I was joking the other day, and my daughter's in 8th grade, and they had to do like a project about parenting where they interviewed their parents. And so one of the questions they asked me was like, how has your work life changed after you're a parent? And I was just like, I reoriented my entire career to do a different job about parenting. She was like, okay, I'll just say it changed a lot.
You're like, how much time
so anyway, so when I got pregnant with my daughter, I started doing a lot of research around, many of the things that one is told in pregnancy, don't have sushi, don't have coffee, and really trying to take the data-based approach, very similar to the kinds of data that I looked at in my job. And that sort of led into Expecting Better. And then yada, 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 there were some more books, and then there was a COVID pandemic, and then things kind of went from there. But that was really the sort of pivotal moment of kind of transitioning from what I was doing before and what I still do some of now into this parenting space. And I really fairly firmly believe that data is useful in all parts of your life. And I try to show that every day. Eventually we moved to Brown, and now I teach at Brown, and I live here, and I have 2 kids, and my husband's still an economist.
Love it. What does it actually mean to be an economist? And so it's interesting, Jen and I are very much online. And so there's like one woman who I think she puts out really great content, but it was funny. I heard her on a very well-respected podcast, and they introduced this person as an economist. And like, she doesn't have any formal training. She just started putting videos out. So I'm curious, like, is there an actual definition of an economist? Like, do you need to have a certain amount of study?
Can one just identify as an economist?
I think so. It's not like being a doctor. When I would say that, I would generally mean someone with a PhD in economics, but that's not like a thing where you get a label, like a white coat.
Yes.
So people could self-identify.
Got it. It's so funny because we had a dietitian on, and she was like trying to explain how it's actually, there's a very real difference between like dietitian and nutritionist. And I do feel like, I don't know, economists like should have this stamp of approval to be one, but
I think what's interesting about being an economist is that people, when they think in the world about what would an economist do, I think the first thing that comes to mind is, finance and stocks and the macro economy. Actually, a huge share of what people with PhDs who are professors in academic departments do is totally not like that. Big data, policy, things that look more like statistics, asking questions that look more like the purview of, sociology or even anthropology. So I'm always afraid someone will be like, oh, you're an economist. What do you know about stocks? I'll be like, buy index funds? Like, I don't know.
That's actually so funny because I was a Brown alum, and anyone who wanted to go into Wall Street, because Brown doesn't have a business school, they would study economics. And so I'm actually curious, like, why did you decide to be a professor? Like, why did you decide to pursue research and not go the sort of financy path? Or like, what was the rationale there?
I love research. I mean, I think I always loved it as a kid. There's this sort of moment when you are a researcher, when you know something that other people don't, like you've sort of figured something out, and then you're the only person who knows it. And like that moment, like for me, is so special, and it's sort of worth all of the other things that come when you do research, like referee reports and other kinds of garbage. And so I really love doing research. I still, I do less research and more writing now, but for me, the experience of getting to do that kind of original work was very tempting. I always knew I wanted, it never really occurred to me to do something else.
One quick question before we move on. This is just like a pet question. My best friend from high school is an econometrics PhD from the University of Chicago, actually. Sure. Can you define for our listeners the difference between economics and econometrics?
Sure. So econometrics is sort of, we would typically think of as a subfield of economics, and it is the subfield that studies the statistics of economics. So if you ask, how do you analyze data? Like, what are the tools you use to do that? Or what are the statistical methods? That is what the field of econometrics is about, trying to figure out those methods and figure out how people who we might think of as more applied economists would use those. But I think of this as a subfield. I understand what it means to have a PhD in econometrics, but we would generally think you can have a PhD in economics and have a subfield of econometrics. My husband is an econometrician.
Oh, cool. You guys must have riveting cocktail party conversation.
Please. It's the best. Yes, so much. I mean, I sometimes will joke and read the titles of his papers relative to the titles of my posts. My posts are like, "Are vaccines good?" And his things are like, I don't know. I can't even.
Like some indecipherable, incredibly specific.
Totally indecipherable.
The third comma in this equation doesn't belong there. Yeah.
Imagine X is in uniform set is like the first line.
Oh my gosh. Well, and actually to the point, I feel like I've seen criticism of your work that like you're not a public health expert, right? You're not a medical doctor. And I mean, I will tell you, like very smart people, I mean, my sister-in-law, for example, she's a pediatric ER doctor, and I gave her your book because, as I tell everyone, like it is the pregnancy Bible as far as I'm concerned, because when you first get pregnant, like you have to read this book. But I mean, I know that she even sometimes for some of the stuff would trust what was in your book over, say, like her OB. And so I'm curious, like, A, what is it about the way that you put yourself out there that has allowed people to trust you so much? Because I think that we're in this sort of environment where there is so little trust in institutions. But I know personally, I mean, again, I sort of look to you as someone I trust deeply on some of these parenting questions. Like, what do you think it is that has allowed you to earn that?
So I think the first thing is I've always been quite clear that I am not a medical doctor. And I think, there is a kind of expertise I bring to this is an expertise in data. And so I really am very good at analyzing data and figuring out which data is good and which is not good. That's where my professional training is. And I think if I think about what I'm doing in the books, it really is that. It's not, here's where the liver is or whatever other pieces of medical information. But I think that trust is built over time. So I think a lot of what happened is people read the books, they connected with the combination of I think honestly, they connect with being treated like an adult. I mean, I think that's the thing I hear about the books is sort of this feeling of like, even if I am going to do everything my OB says, which I think many people do, even if I'm going to do that, I kind of want to understand why. Yeah. And that was not being explained to people. And I think that I bought trust by just telling people like, here's why they're telling you that. And, now you can think about it like an adult and make choices on your own. And then I think I got a lot of trust during COVID because I think for a lot of people, with small kids in particular, I was really there at the beginning of COVID, kind of talking them through some of the data and science and being willing to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. I'm going to come back tomorrow. I'm back in your inbox telling you what we know more. And I think that sort of development of trust over time is not something I take for granted, but I think that was a really important period.
On the flip side of that coin, there's been a number of podcast episodes recently that have aired that we've listened to on more of the traditional economics for business purposes, right? Like the GDP, the et cetera, following Trump's firing of the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We have heard a lot of conversations about how trust in economists is at an all-time low. For you who have cultivated this level of trust on parenting data and everything in your field, why do you think that more broadly speaking, trust in economists is so low right now?
I think that broadly, the administration has attempted to generate a lot of distrust in many experts and many people who are working with data. And I think economists have not been immune to that. I think there's a little bit of a piece where maybe there are some places we could do a better job of kind of helping people understand, in the case of something like the jobs numbers. I think we need to help people understand a bit better, like where those come from and why they might be updated, right? We sort of tell them like, somebody says the numbers got updated. If you know nothing, that can feel like, well, what do you mean they got updated? Like, do you just like make them up? As opposed to saying, the way these are collected is it's through a survey. It's through a survey with sampling error, and we're doing adjustments for seasonal adjustments, and some data comes in later. And so we would naturally expect, both sort of statistical errors and noise, not errors like bias and lying, but statistical errors. And we would expect some adjustment, and there's always some adjustment. And I think just like trying to help people work through like, where does data come from? Which I talked about with audiences, like very, very broad audiences, like where does data come from? People don't really know. They don't really understand when you say this is the number of jobs, how do they know that? People sort of have this idea like that's a magical number that comes from the air and reflects everybody. It's like, well, did they ask you about your job? Like, how do they know? Oh, they asked some people, well, not everybody. And I think we could do more to analyze that, but certainly not being helped by, political manipulation by firing people when you don't get the numbers you want, which is kind of a standard authoritarian tactic.
I wanted to add one more thing. I think another potential way that you may have also gained trust is, again, Jen and I had listened to this Planet Money episode, and they were talking about costly signals. And I do wonder, too, if in 2020, your willingness to sort of be outspoken and go against the grain of like school closures, when everyone who was politically aligned on one side was like, we should be shutting down all the schools, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, actually, the research says we shouldn't. I know you got a ton of pushback for that. And so I do think it kind of goes to, as Jen, as we were saying, like those costly signals showing that like you're willing to say the thing that might not be the easy thing to say, but that is what you feel is correct. So
based on evidence. And
based on
that
evidence.
case, like I thought that the best evidence said one thing, and it was not the same thing that the sort of left had aligned on, and I was glad that I said it.
Well, again, it turned out to be right. Yeah.
I think that raises another question, which is one that we don't typically associate the analyzing of data with being a brave act. But I think that there's like a certain amount of bravery in presenting a conclusion that people don't want to hear. How do you talk to your students, and how do you think about developing the intellectual and emotional discipline to honor what the data says when it doesn't confirm, say, your personal biases?
I think this is a very hard aspect for everybody. And in an ideal world, when we do good science, we should come into our approach to science with a kind of open mind as to what we will learn. In some sense, like if you already knew the answer, why'd you do the research? If you were already so sure that something was true, like why do this at all? Like why are we collecting data? And I think that when I talk to my students, I sort of talk about that as a way into understanding even what's a good question. What's going to make a good academic paper? Well, a good academic paper is going to be made if the question you're asking is interesting kind of in either direction, right? And so that's like, if you're only planning to confirm something you already thought, then that's not going to be a very good paper. And so I try pretty hard to kind of come into the things that I look at with as much of an open mind as possible, which I will say for me, like everyone else, is difficult. And I think it's hard, it's hard in your research, it's hard in your parenting. You don't want to go in and be like, oh, here's this thing I did, or this thing I feel I want to do. And like, now the data tells me it's bad, but I try pretty hard to turn that off.
I literally heard today, The Daily had an episode about, the cognitive effects of giving poorer families money, and how nothing necessarily, like it didn't show anything that they expected. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that like you don't want, like that it's not beneficial. It just might not be beneficial for that one thing. Actually, I respect the New York Times more because I'm surprised that they almost publish that, because it does seem to go against what I would have assumed they would want to be sharing. But I'm just kind of curious. Can you talk a little bit just about, I mean, for people who don't have a PhD, who maybe haven't taken statistics, I love in Expected Better when like you break down the hierarchy of different types of research studies. And I saw you recently talk about the ChatGPT summarized report that I think the RFK people put out. And you were like, the issue is not just that they made up the studies, it's that they didn't even look at the studies, because studies can say one thing. You can find a study that says whatever you want. You can find a study that says like, drinking 5 drinks a night is going to be like great for your health, but you need to look at like, how is it done? So again, I would love if you could just kind of frame what is the hierarchy of research and like how to evaluate those studies.
Yeah. So I think the sort of biggest split I would have here is between studies that are randomized and studies that are not. So we're sort of often talking about a kind of study where you want to know, like, is some behavior leading to some outcome? So if I eat more red meat, does it make me die? If I, drink coffee, does it make me live for, like, a bunch of things like this. It comes up in nutrition, it comes up in parenting, comes up kind of everywhere. So sort of think about a general approach where people are going to do things and I want to know if it leads to some outcome. So one way to do that, the like gold standard approach to that, is to randomize, to take a bunch of people, randomly allocate them into a group that does one thing and a group that does something else, follow them over time and see if the outcomes differ. And the reason that's so valuable is that you are manipulating this one factor and the people are otherwise similar because you've chosen them randomly. And so then if you saw differences at the end, you would be like very confident that the differences were due to this thing you manipulated. And that's how we do drug trials, and it's how we do other kinds of things. It's not generally the kind of data that we bring to bear on these sort of more lifestyle questions. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's actually quite hard to run a study of that nature. You need a lot of data. It's expensive. And it's hard to get people to change their behavior. So there's like a bunch of reasons why we don't see that. Instead, what we very commonly see are studies which just compare people who do one thing to people who do another. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, those people are very, very different in other ways, some of which you can observe and some of which you cannot observe. And so, like, the sort of example I always sort of want to pull down for people is a study that got a lot of attention in the last couple of years about screen time and cognitive development. And so they compared cognitive development for kids who had watched more than 4 hours a day of screens before the age of 1 to kids who watched basically no screens a day before the age of 1. And the cognitive development, lo and behold, was lower for the kids who watched 4 hours of screens. And so then they said, screen time leads to lower cognitive development. But I sort of asked people, like, have an image in your mind of a household in which a kid's watching 4 hours of screens a day before the age of 1 and a household where they watch no screens. Do those households seem similar to you? Mm-hmm. No, they don't. And do you think that, like, a simple control, if I told you, well, I've told you the education of the parents, now do they seem similar? If you hold that constant, no. Like, there are so many other things that are different. And so studies of this sort of observational frame, I think, are really, really deeply flawed because many of the things we're most interested in studying are just not chosen randomly. People don't randomly decide what kind of diet to eat. They don't randomly decide how to raise their kids. And so all of those things are wrapped up in other things. And often when we then look at better data, the kinds of relationships we see in this observational data really don't show up. So for me, those kind of studies are mostly very bad. There is variation, and we can get into sort of more nuanced variation about, like, sometimes you can do a much better job, even without randomization, if you are able to exploit natural randomization or, other kinds of things that drive people's behavior. And that's actually, we talked about econometrics. That's a lot of what econometrics is basically figuring out, like, given what I have in the data, like, what can I do to improve how my causality is? But many of the kinds of studies that we're looking at in things like the Maha report don't really do anything except just comparison people and, those. And then there's, like, other kinds of deeper problems.
Yeah.
Statistics it's always easy to make up. It's always easy to find data to, like, make up data in a way that supports the thing that you want. And that's unfortunate.
Well, and actually, so what do you recommend for people who are, like, try to take this idea and apply it to, their financial analysis or, like, markets? Because with that, there's so many things where you get some piece of information, whether it's like the jobs data is down or GDP was up or whatever it is, like inflation's not going up, even though, like, maybe if you peek behind the curtain, it is for some consumer products. Like, can you think of a way to try to almost, like, separate the signal from the noise better for people who are kind of in the more investing space?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I would say sort of two things. So one is you should always be paying a lot of attention to where data comes from. And so there are biases in how data is collected and, like, who it comes from, where it comes from, that are probably understandable. And then the second is when we are thinking about things where it's like a causal question of, did X cause Y? I almost always tell people, like, put on your head and ask, where's the randomness in X? Like, in order to figure out a sort of causal relationship there needs to be some randomness in X. And, is there a way to isolate that? And honestly, I talk about these issues with a huge share of people, including, like, middle school students. And I find that many people have pretty good instincts about causality, which I think sort of get destroyed as we train people more and more in data. You sort of start to think that, like, somehow there's a magic way to fix these problems, but there isn't. There isn't a magic way to make your data causal. And so I just, like, it's almost just like put your untrained hat on and be like, is it really likely? Let me just, like, think about if I were just a person and not all steeped in, like, oh, there's so many numbers. Does this seem likely?
Yeah.
Yeah. We interviewed the co-CIO of Bridgewater, our friend Karen Carneal-Tambor, and she talked about Ray Dalio, legendary investor. And she was like, I don't know how Ray gets to the office every day because he questions everything so intensely that she's like, I don't know how he trusts that the internal combustion engine still works, right? Because it's like, well, why, right? Like, well, are we sure? Like, was this done right? So I can totally understand how when taken to these extremes, you can end up in this place where it's like, just hang on, like simplify it a little bit. Like, to your point, like, what does your gut tell you? What does your lived experience as a human being in this world where the laws of physics hold true tell you? Does this pass the smell check, right? Like,
does it seem does it seem likely? Does it seem likely that swimming twice a week adds 20 years to your life? Does that seem like plausible? No.
Like, I mean, I wish I could pick your brain for an hour. This is so beyond the scope of this podcast, but we talk a lot about like biohacking, right? How when men started doing it, it was biohacking. When women were doing it, it was fat diets. And like, if men were to take up knitting as a hobby, we'd call it like power tangling, like all the, right?
Well, the intermittent fasting thing, it's funny because again, for men, it's like they do it. Whereas again, if for women, it's eating disorder behavior. But again, with the guys, there probably is too. So it's like,
yes, I think the idea that somehow like the men who are microdosing on Ozempic so they don't eat all day, like that's also an eating disorder.
Yeah.
Like we had that. Like, please.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you mentioned looking at something objectively, because I remember listening to my parents when they were younger, they wanted to have kids and they like really struggled and they tried all these things and like the doctors didn't know what was wrong. And I remember asking my dad one day, like, what was wrong? And he's like, she was too thin. And like, that's almost certainly what it was. But like a doctor never said that. Like they were just like, I don't know, like your numbers say this. And it was never the most obvious thing. And it's like, yeah, well, I mean, someone who doesn't have a medical degree and is just like living could tell that. I mean, and obviously that's not always the case, but I'm just saying it's funny how,
totally.
Yeah. Now economists in general are oftentimes informing public policy. I'm curious if there's examples of where like bad data drove poor public policy in the health space, in the economic space, or in the, financial space.
There's like many bad policies.
There's so many.
How could we
possibly choose one bad policy?
I think one of the things that happens in a field like economics is you sort of do studies and they show something that you think might work and then it doesn't translate into policy. Let me give you an example where like we sort of know something and then when it goes to implementation, it sucks. So in education, one of the things we sort of know works very well to bring kids like up to grade level if they are behind is high dose tutoring. So like the class size matters, one-on-one engagement matters. And so if you do sort of high quality, high dose tutoring with kids, you can improve their achievement a lot. During the pandemic, after everybody realized that keeping kids out of school was a disaster, they're like, high dose tutoring, we're going to put our money in that. Like, we know that thing works. But when they implemented it, it was like we paid a company to like give everybody a login for this high dose tutoring company thing, which is not what was in the interventions. And then, of course, that didn't work at all. And so I think it's less that the sort of here's a terrible policy and more like we actually know more about what would make good policies. And then we either don't do it or we don't do it in a way that would really lead to those policies.
Yeah, makes sense.
I mean, and speaking of well-intentioned policy with oftentimes complex outcomes, you are an expert on parenting data. And we have so many listeners who are parents or want to be parents in extremely high intensity, high stress, long hour careers, working on Wall Street in the investment space or otherwise. And one of the things that's been so interesting is seeing the evolving attitudes at the corporate level and policies towards trying to facilitate more specifically senior women. And obviously this applies to both men and women as parents as they, grow in seniority through these organizations. But there has been this really concentrated effort to try to keep women in the workforce longer at these institutions. And there's been a number of different ways that companies have tried to address that by saying, hey, listen, we're going to, whether it's like give you health benefits towards freezing eggs, whether it's we're going to increase flexibility so you can work from home, et cetera, et cetera. There's been all these different types of policies that firms have put into place with mixed results. And now that we are in basically everybody go back to work, right? Everyone go back to the office as the pendulum swings back and forth on these various different things. Can you separate the wheat from the chaff for us about like people choosing to have children at a more advanced maternal age? Kristen here is 41, if you don't mind me saying. Yeah. And I mean, not slowing down, like could easily have 6 more kids if she wanted to.
It will not be.
So I'm just curious, like what myths did we grow up with and did these companies grow up with that they're now trying to address that haven't been borne out by the data?
I think there's one piece of this which is about sort of maternal age, where I think it's worth just like kind of level setting about what is true. So people are often told, 35 is the cliff, and when you turn 35, like your eggs are done, and like good luck with that. That's not true. There is no cliff at 35. Plenty of people get pregnant. People on this podcast after 35. It is also true that your fertility declines over time. And I think that we are sort of sometimes in an effort to kind of reassure people, like your fertility doesn't fall off a cliff at 35. We probably miss the opportunity to be like, the most important determination of whether you'll be able to get pregnant is your age. And like, it would have been like a lot easier to get pregnant when you're 20 than it will be when you're 40. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but there is an age relationship here. And I think, things like egg freezing have the potential to change that a little bit. But I will say, like, this kind of idea that is sometimes sold to people that, egg freezing is like a perfect insurance policy. Right. And it's just like basically like freezing yourself at 20. That's not true. We don't know that, like, this is not perfect. And it is pretty invasive to turn your eggs into embryos and then into babies. So it's not like freezing your whole reproductive system at 20.
And it's also then, like, meaningful when you choose to take that step, right? So I think so many of our peers said, okay, well, I'm 39. I'm charging full speed ahead in my career. No signs of slowing down anytime soon. I don't even want to think about a family. Time for me to go freeze my eggs. And then have a very discouraging conversation potentially with their healthcare providers about what that looks like. And they were like, well, why didn't someone tell me when I was 18 or whatever, like going out and partying in college, like, hey, by the way, in your spare time, you should be doing this, but then you don't have the finances. So like, I'm curious, based on the data that you've seen, if you had a magic bullet and could say, like, here on a silver platter, all of these institutions that want to promote women who want to have families or are thinking about families, or that's part of the conversation for them, what should maybe some actionable things that these companies can do to support people who may or may not want to have families look like from that entry level position onward?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's like a few frames of this. So I think one is like you tell people like, we'll pay for you to freeze your eggs when you're 25. Like we'll pay to do that when you first start. And then that's one thing that, is there for the future. So that's one thing. I think that then as we think about people's choices later, there are a lot of different things that firms, I think, could do to support people's family having, none of which are perfect. And I think there's a kind of a balance here, which is, so we can list, okay, good maternity leave. Most of these kind of firms are going to have, good parental leave of some number of months, help with childcare. There's childcare in the building. Like you put a Bright Horizons downstairs, like that's probably going to make your life a lot easier in terms of, finding help, helping families think a little bit about like what happens when your kid is sick. Your kid's going to be sick. They're getting sick. And, do we have a backup care option? Like there are some things which you could just sort of think logistically about how to help people. I do think for a lot of people, having some remote work is of value. Going like a little bit deeper, there's a lot of evidence that women in particular are more interested in some flexibility in their work schedules. Yeah. And, I've talked about this like before the pandemic. I wrote a piece that was about like end the plague of secret parenting. And it was like, we need to be more visible about our parenting and sort of recognize like if you have little kids, like the hours between 5 and 8 p.m. are actually like really important. That may be like the only time you see your kid. And plenty of high intensity people would be happy to log back on at 7:30 or 8 when their kid is in bed, but really don't like being asked to stay in the office until 6:30 and then get home at 7:15 and see their kid for 4 minutes. Like, so how can you make the job work? Move the hours, or at least, recognize that that isn't the mommy track. And I think that like senior people, senior men could probably help by doing more of that themselves. I also think, and this is probably less popular opinion, we do have to recognize that children take time and that there are only 24 hours in a day, and expecting yourself to work the same number of hours that you did before when you have kids is probably not realistic. And that's just like, it's just a thing. It's just a trade-off. Like, we face trade-offs in different parts of our lives. And like, I wouldn't trade having my kids for anything in the whole, like, it's the greatest thing. I love them. I love being with them. It's great. But like, I'm not going to say that like it doesn't take time away from work. My kids are at sleepaway camp right now. I am working a lot when they are there.
Yeah, mine are stuck home during a monsoon, and it has been nothing but challenging. But to your point, I think also conversations that we're unwilling to have honestly is about how potentially the schedules of younger people who don't have the same kind of family responsibilities complement the schedules of potentially people who are a little further along in their cycle of life who may have a family at that point. So for example, when I was a 21-year-old analyst, the idea of getting into the office at 6:30 was like, whoa, this is awful. Like, get me back to bed, right? Like, but I don't have anything going on at 5 p.m., 6 p.m. My dinner reservations are never before 9:30 when I'm that age. So like, put me in, coach. I will happily work that evening shift while you senior person go do this, but like maybe I can come in a little later in the morning, right? Like, why don't we have more thoughtful conversations and trade-offs about where there's a natural fit for people to back each other up? But I feel like it's because we can't be honest about what people need, right? Like, you can't,
totally, because like they don't want to say
parenting
it's like
in secret.
Because you're secret parenting, and then those people are like secretly exercising or whatever they're doing, secretly their other thing, secretly sleeping.
Secretly sleeping, yes.
Secretly sleeping, and the plague of secret sleeping among the young.
Yeah, I mean, we have now 3 women as our entire company, and our company calendar is literally like Kristen at OB appointment, like Jen kids fencing lesson or whatever it is. And we are very much parenting out in the open so that someone can book a meeting and drop it in. And we're not being like, oh yeah, I have another doctor's appointment. This is my 12th dentist appointment of the week. Like, no, it's not. Are your teeth falling out?
I also think too, I do wonder if there's almost like a bigger penalty for men, but I do notice that, for example, like my husband, like he needs to be working during work hours all the time, but then he's basically picking up the slack for me when then I then end up having to like do more work during those off hours on weekends to try to like get all this stuff in because he has to be in the office at 8:30. I think that there's also a perception that if he weren't to be in there at that time that he's slacking off. And by the way, like, why is it that schools are from like 7:30 to 3? Like, what? And because it's really hard, by the way, to find part childcare for just that window. That's a whole other conversation. But
speaking of
no,
men,
I think
Kristen,
I do think there just is a kind of attitude here, which is not facilitated by not having these conversations, and where people don't want to say, like, it's really important to me to be at my job because I really care about it, and it's really important to me with me and my kids because I also really like them, and I'm trying to like combine those two things.
Yeah.
Kristen, you were talking about the dual standard maybe for men and women, but one thing that there's been a very noticeable uptick in is the trend of also men thinking about fertility planning. And Kristen, you had brought up the very public example as a reference of Craig Conover on Southern Charm.
Do you watch any of the Bravo shows, Emily? You're like, no.
Sorry,
Emily. I mean, you are the most highbrow, like data driven. What is the complete?
No, that's not true. I
opposite
watch plenty of garbage TV. Southern Charm is not among it.
May I make a recommendation? But, as we have actually had more inclusive policies at these firms about men, and men are becoming more a part of the parenting conversation, I'm curious, like, is there data to support, like, hey, if we're telling all women we're going to pay to freeze your eggs, are men supposed to be freezing their sperm?
No, men don't need to.
That's what I... Thank you.
I love it. She's just like, no.
I didn't understand why he was doing that.
No.
He's
Your
like 35.
sperm, like maybe it decays a little bit, but not in a meaningful way. The much more important thing for men is in the time when you start trying to conceive, there are some sort of like, I don't know, optimizations, or like, it's like a little bit strong, but probably optimizations that you could do, generally, like if you really want to have the best chance for this, you like don't drink heavily, don't do a lot of marijuana, try to keep your testicles like a little cooler, don't do a lot of like endurance biking with the hot shorts.
Oh, interesting.
Stop going in the sauna for like this sperm. But sperm takes two months, basically 64 days to like sort of cycle through, and so it's like a much quicker turnaround to fix it up nice.
Well, I I will say, I do have a question. I was telling you about like how my mom had trouble getting pregnant when she was younger. She got pregnant with me by accident at 38 and my brother like without trying at 40. I have been very fortunate, and like even older, it's been easier. And I know that's not the case for most people. By the way, I was told when I was younger, it would be like impossible for me to have kids without IVF. I just had, again, same issue that my mom had. I was like too thin and I needed to gain weight and like cut out some exercise and like poof, which went against kind of the standard advice, which is like, you should be, exercising a lot, blah, blah, blah. But the data that's out there, it's like your chance of getting pregnant every month at 40 is like 10%. And that has not been the experience of my friends. One of my other best friends is having a baby in about a week, and she's also going to be turning 41 as well. Anecdotally, and again, I know anecdotes, like this goes against everything that you stand for, but anecdotally, the people that I know who had an easier time when they were younger tended to have an easier time when they were older. Like, so I'm just curious, is the quality of the data out there like that good?
So I think the answer to how good is this data is, not very good. To think about why, you can sort of think about what you're really asking here, right? Like, what would you really want? What you really want is a population of people where you start with them when they're 20 and you record tons of stuff about them. And then you figure out like, when did they start trying to get pregnant? And you ideally figure out what they do to try to get pregnant. Like, how hard are you trying? Some version of that. And you sort of see their fertility and then you kind of track it over time. We just don't have any data like that. And so a statistic like 10% of people, the chance of pregnancy after 40 is like, that's based on something like a study of, 2,000 people that followed people over a year. And that would be a good study, right? It's like sort of 2,000 people we've at different ages, we follow them over a year, we look at the pregnancy rates. And so that's not really what you want to answer your question. Right. Because if I told you this person already got pregnant at 38, then I've learned something about that person's fertility, right? If I told you this person, they're 40 now and they've been trying for 5 years without success, I'm going to tell you like, that's not 10%. And if you tell me like last year they got pregnant at 39, it's also not 10%, but they're in the other direction. And we just don't have the kind of richness in the data that we would need to see that. There's an interesting possibility if you sort of ask, well, how could you learn about that? I think some of these fertility tracking apps have the potential to help us learn a little bit more about that, because although the samples are really selected and it's kind of a weird population, there is a lot of data. Mm-hmm. So you can sort of think about like, what could I learn from this kind of weirdly selected sample, but where I see like a huge amount of detail about like, Jen, do you have a Whoop?
I do.
Yeah. So I feel like, you get people's Whoop data, like, when they have sex, right? I mean, that's like, that shows up in your.
Does it really?
Yeah.
Well, if you journal.
Depends how good it is. If it's really good, it'll show up in your Whoop.
That's amazing. So just to piggyback on this, we're asking a lot of questions about fertility and about like decisions to have families kind of within the context of the workforce. Just overall speaking, what are people after right now? Like, what are most people asking questions about? Like, what do you think the next frontier is in data that like people should be looking at?
Most of the questions people ask me are things they should not worry about, I would say, to be totally frank. Like ideal, like a my doctor told me not to worry about my kids asymmetric crawling, but TikTok PTs said that I should worry about it. Should I worry? Is it safe for babies? I'm just literally listing things that I was asked this morning. Is it safe for babies to wear socks? So like most of the stuff that comes up, I think we've sort of generated a level of anxiety in a lot of new parents. And I think I see a sort of particular audience, but like, I think we've generated a level of anxiety in new parents, which makes it feel like every moment is an opportunity to ruin your child forever. Mm-hmm. And so, that's bad.
Yes.
If we ask like, what are the big questions that I think people are wondering about where we could use better data? I think there are some questions in sort of fertility and conception, which are unanswered, which I think really getting back actually to where you started with the question of how firms should help with this. Like if, you took someone at 20 and they said like, I would eventually like to have a family, like what's the right advice to give people at different stages? How should we, if somebody comes at 34 and they say, I really want to have a kid, like, how do we help them like optimize to get the best chance of that happening, as quickly as possible, knowing that like you don't have an infinite number of egg years left. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some stuff in the data there where we could be doing better. And then there's tons of questions in early parenting that like screens and food and sleep and stuff where like better data would help people make at a minimum more competent decisions. I think the truth is that in most of those spaces, the actual choice you make doesn't matter too much. And so much of what we learn from those studies is just like different things are fine. But it would help people make those decisions more confidently.
I just want to highlight what you said, which is, it's funny because, again, obviously I just went through the experience of like being pregnant, and it was my 4th time. And again, like amazing amount of anxiety. It's like, oh my God, I had sushi and I didn't know I was pregnant. Like, did I just ruin my child or whatever it is? I mean, and even now.
Botox.
Yeah.
Botox. I had Botox before I knew I was pregnant.
Yes. Yeah.
Every week.
Yeah. I'm sure.
I had tequila shots.
Well, that was another thing.
With your Botox?
I was pre-Botox when I was pregnant, but definitely in peak tequila shot era.
Nobody is pre-Botox anymore. That's the main thing I've learned from my audience. No one is pre-Botox.
You know what? I'm actually post-Botox. I've scaled back.
I have never done Botox. I'm afraid of needles.
What are your secrets? Oh my God, you look amazing.
Don't do Botox.
That's the secret.
I know the secret is no Botox. Botox just begets Botox. I know this is a little bit of a third rail, but autism is top of mind right now. Kristen, you referenced the RFK MAHA study that was done. And I personally have an autistic nephew. My best friend's son is autistic. And I'm curious, do you get a lot of questions from parents about autism? You know, the friend I referenced earlier who was an econometrics PhD at Chicago actually did his dissertation on autism before it was like the hot topic that it is today. I'm curious, like, what studies are being done? What have you seen in the data other than, I remember you doing a post that was concurrent with the release of that report that was about an analysis of the data collection and the reporting and things like that. And I'm curious if you could share your findings on that front with our community, you know, who may or may not be curious about this.
Yeah. So it's basically 2 core questions I get about autism. So one is like, what is the link between vaccines and autism, which I actually think is a fairly straightforward question to answer, which is that there is no link. And we have a lot of data to suggest that that isn't true. I think a more complicated question is, okay, but why has it gone up? And I think that's really where a lot of people have landed, which is like, okay, I guess I believe you that, you know, vaccines are not the thing, but like something has happened and it's very clear that the rates of diagnosed autism have gone up a lot over time. And so in that post, I was kind of trying to break down basically what is the reason. And, you know, there is one very, very, very important reason for why this has gone up, which is diagnosis. So we have changed the set of things we diagnose as autism quite a lot. We have conflated a bunch of, not for bad reasons, but just sort of as kind of diagnostic criteria have changed over time in the past, you know, basically 30 years, there have been moves of, you know, diagnoses. We used to call it this thing, and then we just decided to call it autism. So there's that. And then there's a change in screening. So we used to not screen people. Now everybody gets screened for autism at a visit. And that's really good because that means we're identifying kids who could use, you know, early intervention or other kinds of help or get services that they need. And we're identifying, you know, more girls and more kids of color and more low income students and all kinds of things where like there's a lot of value. So it's a bunch of like just practical reasons why this has gone up over time. I think what's really tricky about this space, and I really have an answer to, is that explains something between 60 and 100% of the increase. And, you know, 60%, 100% of the increase. And then if it's 100%, I guess we're done. If it's 60%, there's like more to do. And I think if you sort of say, okay, I don't think it's vaccines, but like what else is it? I think that's a much harder question to answer. There are like different theories, you know, parental age probably does play some role. There are some theories about assortative mating that basically like, as
that was the dissertation that
right. So the idea that as people match with other people who are sort of more like them, and like basically you get a bunch of tech firms and people who are on the spectrum of autism, like somewhere on the spectrum already, are matching with each other, and then, you know, there's a sort of genetic reason. So it's like a bunch of stuff like that. But we know that a very large share of this is genetic, but that's different from saying we understand why it's gone up. So it's like a little unsatisfying.
Well, but I think it's important to also say that we're unsatisfied and we still don't know, right? 60 to 100%. I'm no statistician, but like that's a wide range.
It's a wide range, totally. But I think what's sort of very frustrating about the current moment is like, we can all agree we're not 100% sure what is going on. And then, you know, you get kind of the RFK people coming in and being like, okay, we're going to tell you what the answer is. And I'm really, really, really not confident that the answer they're going to come up with is one that is based on data because of different things.
Well, I mean, it's funny, right? It's like one of the things, if you're looking at, I mean, an argument that I know a lot of MAHA people make when it's like, okay, well, this data, this study that shows whatever, high fructose corn syrup's not bad for you, it was sponsored by the whatever, high fructose corn syrup association or Coca Pepsi, or Trump fires the BLS because he doesn't like the data. Then the next month when the data maybe looks better, even if it was completely legit, you're like, well, he fired the person that was sort of the messenger that things were bad. Like they're going to have an incentive to say that things are good. And back to your point, it's like RFK says, we're going to find what's causing autism. You know what his bias is. So if he's putting out a report, you're like, again, the bias is in there. So it's really hard to trust.
It's just like your report's sponsored by the high fructose corn syrup lobby. Like this report is sponsored by the people who hate vaccines lobby. And, that's like a very real, constituency. And I think it's very hard to believe that we're going to get, something that is helping us answer this question.
Seriously. Well, I think a couple of other topics I'd love to touch on because these are things that I know I have personally used. Well, I am a parent data subscriber, so but yes, I have used.
Do you ever talk to the chatbot? We have a chatbot.
I haven't, but I actually should.
The chatbot. Our chatbots, I like it because I think that people do too much late night panic Googling. Particularly in the first 4 months of parenting. And this is like a way to just ask the question of something that will
I love this. Yeah. I used to just text my doula and be like, it's 3 a.m. I know someone's giving birth somewhere. Answer my question.
Actually, I need to because I was panic Googling. Again, this is my fourth child and I was panic Googling because my baby has been rolling over since they were 2 or 3 days old. And of course, the internet says that can mean horrible things. So you're like, oh my God, what's wrong with my child? So I need to specifically look through your thing for that. Yeah. But so some of the things that I had looked up though are about sleep training, right? Or about formula or about working, if you're away from your kid, the internet tells you drop your kid at daycare, you've basically harmed them for life. So I'd love if we could touch on some of those topics. Sure. Specifically, let's start with sleep training because I feel like sleep is essential if you are a parent and going into the office and having a kid that doesn't sleep is obviously miserable. So what does the data say about sleep training?
The data said that sleep training is a great option if it's something that you want. I think there's sort of maybe 2 questions people do ask and one that they should. So the first is, does it work? And here we're talking about anything that's kind of involves a cry it out. And I want to be clear that when you say sleep training, you talk about, doing some sleep training at 4 months or 3 months, generally that early, you're not talking about your kids sleeping through the night. You're sort of talking about helping them learn to fall asleep at the beginning of the night. Maybe they still eat. So there's more of an art to this than a science in the sense that this means a lot of different things. But the first question people ask is, does it work? And the answer is yes, on average, babies will sleep better after this. They'll wake up less. The second is, will it harm them forever and cause them to never be successful adults? And there is no evidence for that. And in fact, we have in this case, reasonably good randomized trials that follow kids through sort of early childhood and find that the kids who are sleep trained look just like the kids who are not sleep trained. And even in the short run or the long run, we don't see any differences in behavior, emotional regulation, or anything like that. I will say, people will come on the other side and say, how do you know that it's not going to show up when they're 40? But you could pretty much say that about anything, or you could say in the other direction, how do you know that the lost sleep isn't going to show up when they're 40? You don't know. Mm-hmm. And that part of the magic of parenting is you never know which thing you have done will impact them good or bad later. And that is just an uncertainty we have to live with. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing I want to say about sleep training is people don't ask, are there any other things I should know about this? And initial studies of sleep training are really focused on mental health of the parents. So we see, reductions in maternal depression, improvements in marital satisfaction, not sleeping is a form of torture. It's a way we torture people.
Yep.
Is by not letting them sleep. And so, it's not that surprising to find that if people's kids are sleeping better and they're sleeping better, that the functioning of the family is better. And I think that's probably something we shouldn't ignore.
Right.
Well, I think that begs the next question of time spent with your children and the marginal utility of every minute/hour that you spend with them, thinking about quality versus quantity. I know personally, for example, if I'm well rested, the kind of parent that I am is a much better parent. So the likelihood that we're engaging in like stimulating activities versus me just trying to survive and like clinging on for dear life while my child like bats a ball around is definitely impacted by sleep. And I can see that having follow-on consequences. But talk to us about what data there is about, hey, should I be home with my child for 12 hours every single day, watching them prove that the laws of gravity hold true by pushing a little train up and down on the same tracks? Or like, is it more meaningful for me to have those hours between 5 and 8 p.m. where I'm totally dialed in as a parent and giving them stimulating activities?
I feel like that was a leading question.
Guilty as charged.
When we look at the data on things like sort of daycare versus nanny versus parent being home or grandparent or whatever, there really is not much evidence in either direction that any of these particular things is better than another. So, we think about like daycare, for example, in particular relative to having a single caregiver. So compare like high quality daycare to a high quality home environment, stay-at-home parent or nanny. You see kids who are in daycare, like when you get them in school, they're a little bit better prepared for school academically. Maybe more time in daycare before 18 months has like a small impact on the other direction on behavior. All of these things pretty much just wash out by kind of early childhood. So just like the way that people frame this set of choices, which is kind of the way you framed it, which is like which thing is better for my kid, is actually not a very helpful way to frame, because the answer is any of these can be fine for your kid. Mm-hmm. Instead, let's ask like what is going to work for the family. Right. And that means, financially what works for the family, time-wise, and also like what do I want, right? Like what is the thing I would enjoy doing? Do I want, some people really like being with their kid all day. And for some people, like that isn't the way that they best show up as a parent. And I the thing is, it should be okay, even though it is sometimes not, to say like the reason that I have a job is because I like it. And I enjoy having a job. And I've decided the thing that will make our family work the best is if I have a job and then I spend, this hours a day with my kid. Mm-hmm. And it should also be okay to say like the reason that I stay home is because I really like to stay home. And that's the thing that really works for me. I feel like in both of these cases, we end up sort of apologizing or saying like, well, I'm doing this because like otherwise, because I have to work or because this. But it's like, I like it. I don't have to work. I work because I love it and because I think it's the thing that works for our family.
It's funny. I had this wonderful babysitter and I was talking to her about how I thought it was funny when I went from New York City to Massachusetts, the daily rate for a babysitter went up. So it's something like, in Massachusetts, the starting rate is like $35 an hour. And I think New York, it's like 30, but it's still, it's a lot. And I said to her, I was like, it's in reality, I was like, it's really not that much because it's such an important job and it's hard. And she just was like, well, it's not that hard. She's like, I love it. It's funny because she's studying to get like her business degree. She's like, I feel like I need to aspire to do something like more than just be a babysitter. She was like, but I love it, And so I thought it was such an interesting comment.
Yeah. We had when my younger son was born, we had a nanny named Becky who was amazing. And I remember when he was little, he would like sleep at night in his crib, but he only liked to nap when he was held. Just like he liked to be held while he napped. He'd nap a much longer time if you held him.
My younger son as well.
When I was home with him, he would fall asleep in my arms and I would put him in the crib just as soon as I thought that I could get him down in the crib, and I would like go try to do something for 4 seconds, and then of course he would wake up. But like this was not for me, like sitting there, and she would just sit there for like 2 hours. And I was like, you can try to put him down. She was like, I really like this. Like this is relaxing. Like I just love doing this. And I was like, wow. It's not even that I have something to do. Like this is not for me.
Yeah.
And I love my kids. And I will say my taste for my kids, and this I always find very surprising, has gone up a lot as they've gotten older.
Like, that makes me happy.
I was not a baby person. And now I spend, I think, quite a lot of, probably much more time hours wise with my kids than I did when they were
I couldn't agree more. I loved the newborn stage. Toddlers were not it for me, but I also had a 2 and a 4-year-old during COVID. So
that was not for anyone.
The nightmare, right? Like of being trapped in your home with 2 people who are just mobile enough where everything is dangerous, but not self-sufficient enough where you can take your eye off them for 1 second. Like that was a lot. And then 4 and 6 and on, it's a dream. Like I love my life and I love these kids and I want to spend like every excess second.
They're so fun and interesting. Like they do funny stuff and they say interesting things. Now my daughter's like a real person, and she's like really interesting and smart and nice. I don't know. It's great.
But I do have a lot of respect for the idea that people gravitate towards different parts of like the child life cycle as what they enjoy, like the parts of parenting that they enjoy. And I hear now from my peers or women who had children younger, or some of the women who are slightly older than we are, that now more than ever they feel like the time to be dialed in as parents is middle school and high school. They're like, I'm quitting my job now because it is so much more necessary for me to be a full-time parent in this phase of life because of the technology, all the different things that I have to worry about that we didn't necessarily.
So I totally resonate with that. And I think that there's a thing about the sort of current moment of parenting kids in this older range where we can very quickly land in like too much scaffolding of kids in a moment they have to develop independence. And so like, I think there's such a balance of kind of like your job with your teenager is to like raise them to leave. And that requires a fair amount of time. But if you're always there, you may not be hitting the like, they need to do things for themselves.
One of our friends, two Brown alums as well, they run a dad parenting podcast called Milkless, and we did a crossover episode with them. And they recently shared something that said that statistically, I believe, children, and I don't know how good this data is, so I'd love to know if you've seen this study, but that children who were raised by overprotective fathers had a lower life expectancy, again, based on whatever study. And that children who were raised by overprotective mothers, and again, how you define overprotective, like sounds like there's a lot of variables, and knowing as little as I do about data or whatever, but that those who were raised by overprotective mothers had a longer life expectancy. And I don't know what to make of that data or who did that study.
That sounds not causal, but I would have to take a look.
Well, I don't know how you track that or quantify it or anything, but I thought that was a really interesting and
Jen, who maybe, I'm not saying you're overprotective, but it's funny. I also like randomly found a study that was like women who have kids older tend to have longer life expectancies. Like, I like that study.
So that I think is true, but not because having the kid older is causal, but just because the fact that your fertility is sustained for this period is like probably a signal about your overall health as a person. And so that's a signal, it's not having a kid, it's just that you learned something about yourself.
So basically, if you're over 40, don't go out and have a kid just so that you're going to live longer. Like, it's probably not the biohack that you think it is.
If you could have a kid, being a person who could have a kid at 40 is good for your life expectancy. Actually having the kid at 40, maybe
lower it dramatically.
Yeah, seriously.
Could be lower. Let's not comment.
Well, I actually, I feel like you, to me, are kind of the person that when I'm anxious about something, which tends to be a lot, like I will use, like I said, your data, and usually makes me feel better about things. I'm curious if there's anything that you think that like parents should worry about, or anything that you've seen that like actually does, like you do XYZ thing and it is good for your child, that maybe is surprising or maybe it's not surprising, but like you should do this thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unsurprising stuff. So like you should read to your kid. Like that's probably one thing we have like the best evidence on in terms of cognitive development. Like, don't be like a weirdo and run around after your kid and think like if you're not reading to them at every moment, they're going to be a loser. But like if you said, what could I do at bedtime? Like, it's a good idea to read to your kid. That links with literacy.
And by the way, like this may sound to some listeners like duh. But I just saw some article about the fact that Gen Z does not want to read to their children writ large. That they're like, it's boring. My kid always wants to read the same book. I am stressed about work.
Kids love to read the same book. That's the thing. They love reading the same book. That's their thing.
Love it. Love it. I mean, and the number of books I have committed to memory, I could do a dramatic recital of like the little blue
Could you do Hippos
right
Go
here.
Berserk?
That would
one hippo all alone.
I don't know this one. I need to
3 hippos at the door. Bring along another 4. 5 hippos come overdressed. This is like the greatest Sandra Boynton book.
I need to find this because I thought I owned every single Sandra Boynton book, and apparently I don't, because I don't have that one.
I missed out. Like, I've never heard of half of these.
Yeah, I bought every single one, and Piggy and Gerald. Those are all we've got.
So good. We got to so reading is good. Yes. I will say the thing that if you sort of ask me like what are the things I think people should worry about, I guess I would say like cars are dangerous. Not like shouldn't use your car, but like cars are dangerous.
Right.
Pools and swimming is dangerous, and in a way that, and in some ways, those are sort of, I think, kind of go together because you just don't think about that. And so we're kind of constantly worrying about risks to our kids, which are kind of vanishingly small, but somehow salient, and not worrying about the things that we should. And pools are a thing where actually there's plenty you can do to like make that risk smaller. And then, I always worry about like messing my kids up, but I also think it's very hard to not do that.
But I also think, isn't there to some degree, right, the idea that if you're worrying about messing your kids up, that you're probably less likely to mess your kids up than if that doesn't even cross your mind?
That is certainly true.
Another thing that I noticed is, Kristen, you've talked a lot about how comforting Professor Oster's book was during your pregnancies. And I've heard the same from a lot of my friends who I think self-identify as anxious, that being pregnant and being a parent was or has been the most anxiety inducing. It is like, the crowning achievement of their life of anxiety. And I'm curious if there's any data around anxious parents. I know that there's other writers who have spoken about like the anxious generation and things like that. Is there any data about parental anxiety and how that does or doesn't get passed down to children? And what are some of the ways to mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you certainly find that people who themselves suffer from anxiety are going to have kids who are more likely to do that, and it's very difficult to separate the just genetic sharing that you have with your children from some kind of treatment effect. Parenting is always going to be a somewhat anxious time that people worry about because you care a lot about it. I think we have generated a generation of parents who are a bit more anxious. And again, I think it sort of has to do sometimes with this sense that like the stakes are very high, higher than, maybe our parents perceive them to be. And that I think there's an interesting demographic shift where people are having kids later and they are having kids after they have achieved more things. And so it's sort of like, I achieved going to college I wanted, I achieved the degree I wanted, I achieved the job I wanted, I achieved the promotion I wanted. And you sort of like, if I know from my lived experience that if you work hard at something you care about, like you will improve it. You can like get to the thing that you want. And kids aren't exactly like that. You can work really, really hard and not like achieve the thing you want. And it's not even obvious like what we would mean by achieving. But I think that feeling of like, I've got to get this right to like win it generates a kind of anxiety. And then of course it's worse because it doesn't really work. Right. It's like, it's like I can be anxious about my promotion at my job, but I notice that like when I'm putting the time in, I'm doing this, like things are getting better. And so like that dials down my anxiety. With your kids, it doesn't always work like that. And so it's sort of just like this hamster wheel of.
I think there's so many analogs in the professional world. We talk all the time about how people are pursuing these elite and well-respected careers. And I got to be on the investment banking to private equity track because everyone says that's the best, right? And if I don't get that, I will have failed. And then they may find themselves there and be like, wait a minute, I didn't want this in the first place. Like this career is totally wrong for my, so I actually do think that there's a lot of analogs in the professional world where that, that promotion doesn't do it, right? Or like just because there's some objective measure of success doesn't necessarily mean that you get the satisfaction that you wanted to or perceive that success.
I was going to say, I think people also think that they have a lot more control. I think that it sort of goes back to this like biohacking thing, that it's like every tiny little thing you do is going to have this massive oversized impact on your child. And, that same sister-in-law I was talking about, who's the pediatric ER doctor, I mean, as she put it, she's like, she will have kids come in who have been neglected, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then it's like, and then they end up these like super impressive, thriving adults with, I mean, just it. Yeah. We have been taught so much that like this little thing you do, you ate whatever, your child is going to be destroyed forever. And it's like, no, actually it probably doesn't have that huge effect, and I think
conversely, that organic strawberry isn't going to get your kid into Harvard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that that's a big part of it.
This. Yes. And you can't win with your health with biohacking quite that way either. But
how much of it also has to do with, and this is just me, like just asking questions, but we talk a lot about like declining birth rates and stuff like that in a lot of the highly educated. Obviously, Kristen is really bucking the trend here, and
totally, you're really contributing.
Yeah, exactly. But I am curious. You talked about like prior generations. Not too many generations back, people would have 12 kids and like 3 would make it. And so putting all your eggs in one, it sounds like terrible to say, but like infant mortality was so much higher. You couldn't put all your eggs in one basket with one kid. You were like, nah, just whoever's going to make it, like, let's go. And I am curious now, as people are, being more selective and having smaller families and making these different decisions, how much then that also then increases the stakes for each kid and causes that higher level of perceived anxiety around, like, well, this one is I get one shot, right? Like, you gotta, not to quote Eminem, but.
Yeah. So there's this sort of economics theory that Becker had around quantity quality trade-offs, which sort of relates to this bigger picture demographic shift that as you have fewer kids, you kind of invest more in their quality, which by his standard was human capital. And so I think there is a piece of this, which is for sure going on, that, in a world in which you only have 2 kids, the kind of return to investment in each of them is very different than in a world in which you have 12. And that like that ability to have 2 is sort of facilitated by an increase in basically survival. So I think there's a piece of that. It's been a long time since like that piece of it about mortality was very central, but I do think over time there has been a shift in kind of how much we want to invest. And I think some of it has to do with actually the perceived shape of returns, that people have this idea that like the sort of returns to kids are basically the returns to success are kind of convex. So if I had like the best kid, that's like an incredible, like that's Jeff Bezos, and as inequality has gone up, that's kind of, it's sort of felt more like if I get my kid into Harvard, like that's the top of this convexity. It's kind of worth everything because the returns are so much bigger than if they like went to Middlebury. I think the reality is that's not really true, but that is certainly the perception that drives some of this. The connection to fertility decline is actually pretty interesting, I think, because if you look at the fertility decline, I think a lot of that is driven by people not having any kids, as opposed to people deciding, I was going to have 4 and I'll have 2. It's more like I was going to have 1 and I'm having none.
Yeah.
And I wonder if some of that is because we've like convince people in their 20s that like it's incredibly stressful to have children, and like why would you do that?
Right.
Yeah, I think we've done a bad PR job.
I also think we're doing a great PR job.
I do think, to your point, Jen, that the just amount of effort too that the parents have to put in, that they feel like they have to put in per child, is so high that I think that that's again a huge driver. Just like in the town that I'm in, literally, I do not know a single person with more than 4 kids. Like 4 is the absolute ceiling amongst like, I swear, everyone in this town. And I feel like that's similar in like New York City. One of the
top 10 wealthiest towns in the country, by the way. So it's not like that that personal finance is not the barrier.
Yeah, no, it's not the personal finance. It's more of the time and investment and like just like effort that you have to put in per kid. Like to your point, there's only so many hours in the day. And like, so of those hours that you were spending shuttling XYZ child back and forth, like there's only so many hours in the day. So I think that that's a big part of it as well. Or that's my.
You can't have 6 kids if you're going to parent like this. Yeah, no. Like, you can, like, you just get, like, it's just not like really feasible basically for almost anybody.
I actually think it's really interesting. I'd never thought about the convexity of like the parenting curve. And like as a Bond gal, this is truly a dream to have this conversation. But I think there's also this with the anxious generation that we have. While there may be that positive convexity to the upside, I do feel like there's a perceived negative convexity where you get these compounding, like one thing goes wrong early on and there's this perceived like, oh no, things get worse and worse and worse exponentially because there is less of a path to upward social mobility. That like, if I don't get them into the right kindergarten, then there's no way they're going to get into the right high school, and absolutely no way that they are going to the Harvard. Therefore, investment banking, private equity, all those things, like this whole thing is shut off if you miss this like very critical step of, I joke, the organic strawberry. But like, I do think that there's actually something to that, where so much of what determines your ability to access these opportunities in life is signal, right? That is established through that path very early on.
But I think then you do have to ask the question for people, like, for what is this? What is this for? Like, why do you think it is important for your child to be an investment banker? Or like, are we living our dreams? Like, what's my goal for my kid? I once asked people on Instagram, like, if you look forward 30 years, like, what do you want?
Mm-hmm.
And no one was like, literally no people were like, I want my kid to be an investment banker. You know, they were like,
cancel the podcast.
Nobody mentioned they wanted their kid to be an economist either. You know, it was sort of like, I want my kid to be financially comfortable and I want them to be nice and I want them to come back and visit me and be kind.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, there are a lot of jobs and a lot of like life paths that lead to a kid who is financially stable and kind and comes and eats your cooking. And I think sometimes we've sort of missed our, you know, did you guys watch The Gilded Age?
Yes, I was literally just going to bring that up.
So it's like, yes. I don't want to be Bertha.
Yes.
You know, like, are we like marrying our daughters off to the Duke when they don't want to be just because like we think that like being a Duchess is a great job?
Right.
Maybe they don't want to be a Duchess.
Right. No, I literally like had that exact same thought. We need to get Jen watching The Gilded Age. Okay, I know we're coming short.
It's so good.
It is so good. I know we're running out on time, but I did
economics. Anyway, we talked this offline. Okay.
No, the last question that I wanted to ask. So I had three girls. I just had a boy. Jen has 2 boys. And I feel like one of the other things that people are always curious about is like gender. And actually, when I shared that I was pregnant on our Instagram, it was basically this interview question that Jen had about, you know, you have a family with 4 girls. You have a family with 4 kids, 3 are girls. What's the chance that the 4th is a boy? And it's obviously like combination versus permutation or whatever. But I guess like there was a study that showed that there's the chance of having the same gender is higher. Is that actually true? Or is this like bad data? I'm so curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that study, so we actually have a lot of data. This is not a hard question to answer. It's a little tricky because like it sort of gets biased in a funny way by people's selection choices. So if you said like, you know, you looked only at 2-child families, you'd see a lot more like boy, girl or girl, boy than you would boy, boy, girl, girl, because people who have boy, boy, girl, girl are more likely to continue to a third. So it's actually a little bit hard to suss this out, but it's not impossible. And to do it well, you need actually a lot of data because as you get into like people with 4 kids, 5 kids, you know, there's not that many people like that. And so there is, for example, a study of the entire population of Sweden beginning in 1930. They have everybody from 1930 to like 2011.
Wow.
And they have all of their siblings and they ask, you know, basically, does the gender of your sibling predict your gender? Which is like the simplest way to ask this question. And like, so are people who have boys more likely to have other boys? And the answer is no. The gender of your siblings does not have other. No, the answer is no. Then there's this new study, which is a much smaller sample. It's like 50,000 people instead of like 14 million people. And they do find some, you know, like sort of some slightly increased chance, but it's based on like 140 families or like in sort of once they're cutting to these sort of small number of data, it's like not very many data points. And then they're fitting a model to it. And all of their results are driven by like the model fit. Like not to like get too in the weeds, but like basically in the raw data, they don't really see this. But when they fit the model to it, the beta binomial distribution, they like find this thing. But this is like an example where like, I don't really understand. This is not good. We already knew the answer to this with like a much better data set. I was explaining this to my husband. He was like, couldn't we get the answer to that with a better data set? I was like, yes, they already had an answer with a better data set. Like, I'm not even sure why we would do this.
Yeah, like why are we spending our time?
So basically, if you have 2 of the same gender and you have another kid, it's still 50-50 is the...
Yeah, 51% boys. There's 51% boys. It's just slightly, that's always, at birth, 51% male child.
Which is so interesting. Anyway...
Professor Oster, where can our listeners follow you on social media? And also, can you tell us the names of your books? Because you've done a considerable amount of writing.
Absolutely. So on Instagram, you can find me at Prof. Emily Oster. That's the best social media. The website is parentdata.org. And the books are Expecting Better. That's pregnancy, crib sheet. It's like 0 to 3. Family Firm, which is about the early school years. And then The Unexpected, which is about pregnancy after complications.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.